because Laci was 8 months pregnant with their son, Connor. And the theory of the prosecution was that he killed her because he was having an affair with Amber Frey, and he didn't want a child, and he didn't want to be with Laci anymore. He wanted to be with Amber Frey.
Life is precious, and Laci's life was taken away, and her unborn son was never even given the chance to experience the world. I wish I could have seen what kind of mother Laci would have been. I believe that Scott is guilty of Laci and Connor's murders. The mountain of evidence, Scott's behaviors, his bizarre lies, point to Scott as the perpetrator of these heinous murders. The behavior that I witnessed from Scott after Laci disappeared was not that of a grieving husband or a father-to-be. It was that of a roving bachelor. A man not looking for caring about his missing pregnant wife, but a man who was more interested in our attractive babysitter and portraying himself as a single man.
At the end of our last episode, the Rocha family publicly withdrew their support for Scott Peterson, just a few hours before Amber Frey told the world she'd been his girlfriend for weeks. That was on the 24th of January, exactly 1 month after his pregnant wife Laci Peterson, who was 8 months pregnant with their son Connor, vanished on Christmas Eve. Scandalous photos of Scott posing with Amber Frey ran in the National Enquirer the week before, and the media began hounding Amber not long after. The press conference didn't do much to satisfy the ravenous media, but directly after Amber spoke, Police Chief Roy Wasden made it clear to reporters that there'd be no more detail about Amber Frey or the Rocha family forthcoming, issuing the following statement himself.
And as we reported a minute ago, she's cooperated in the investigation, and we've eliminated her from...
You know, we really do appreciate the media and all the effort and attention to help us find Laci. You have been a tremendous help in getting the word out on Laci. I do believe our entire nation, and possibly most of the world, is aware that Laci Peterson is missing. And we want to find her. We want to find her and bring her home. Now, what this is starting to do is border on pretty close to being destructive. We're not going to discuss with you the in-depth part of this investigation. We're not going to discuss with you the investigation in Laci. We're not going to discuss the relationships. We're not going to discuss where or when or how. We've given the information that we feel we need to give, and we need to give that information so that a young woman who had the courage to come forward and give us information will not be harassed as she tries to go on with her life.
Why did you bring her forward tonight?
Because media people located her and were contacting her.
Is she from Fresno?
I'm not going to discuss where she's from.
Was Scott forthcoming in the first?
The investigation is moving forward, and we will continue to move the investigation forward.
Was Scott the one who told the detectives that he was involved with the girlfriend, or was it her?
Let me do this one more time. We are not going to talk about what we have been told. We're not going to talk about what people have said. We've given the information we can give. The investigation is going to continue. Yes, Ted?
The family today asked Scott Peterson to cooperate completely with the Modesto Police Department. Could you again give us an indication of his level of cooperation?
I cannot. I won't comment on those things. Okay, I'm gonna try to answer Ted's question. Okay, Ted. Laci's family is going through a horrible time, and you all saw Laci's family today, and they're dealing with their life as a family. I am not going to comment about Scott. This department's not going to comment about Scott. We're not going to comment about the investigation. And so, I mean, I know it's frustrating to you that we can't make this case a public understanding of everything that's involved. We cannot do that. It wouldn't be appropriate or right. So we're not going to talk about those things. Laci's family has information that they've decided to share. I respect that. I appreciate what they're going through. And, you know, their appeal today, you heard it. Okay, now I'm going to go back here.
Is it true that we should focus on Laci and bring her home to tearing down the young lady and disrespecting her life and whatsoever? And focus on bringing this lady home to Peterson.
Well, that's our focus, is to solve this case and get Laci home.
You think she's been cleared as a suspect?
She's been eliminated as a suspect.
Can you tell us based on what?
No, I cannot. I won't discuss that.
Were the Rocha and Peterson families notified that she was going to come out tonight and speak publicly?
Yes.
Chief, as far as, we haven't talked in a while, so as far as someone backing up Scott's story that they saw him at the marina, anybody come forward yet?
You know, we're just not going to go down those paths, and we're not going to discuss those things. The investigation is continuing to move forward. We, I believe, when I checked just before coming down here, have received close to 4,500 tips on the tip line at this point in time. There are continuing information and leads as the investigation evolves that we have to follow up on, and we're doing that.
Are you any closer to finding Laci now than you were the last time you briefed us?
I don't believe there's a significant change that I can articulate. Are we closer? I hope so. I don't know.
Is Scott now considered a suspect? You said he
We have not eliminated Scott Peterson from this investigation.
You know where he is now?
I don't know.
What about forensic evidence?
We're not going to discuss any of the evidence.
Is this still a missing persons case?
Yes, this is still a missing persons case.
It's not considered a homicide case?
Well, this is still a missing persons case. We would love to find Laci alive and well and bring her home safe.
Is the police department keeping tabs on where Scott's going?
We're not going to discuss that.
What's her profession?
Whose?
Amber.
Not going to talk about that.
Has Amber had any contact whatsoever with Laci's family?
We're not going to discuss Amber. Amber gave you her statement. You have the information that Amber was comfortable sharing with you. She's asked to have her privacy respected. We are going to do that. We're not going to comment about Amber, her private life, where she works, where she lives, any of those things. Amber wants to be able to go on with her life.
How did Laci's family learn about Amber?
The question earlier was, did we talk with the family? Yes, we talked with the family, with Laci's family.
Are the police conducting any searches organized by the police, either inside or outside the county?
We are continuing with searches. We're not disclosing where those searches are. And yes, there are searches that are continuing. Okay, we've about wound it down. There's other things I need to do and that you all need to do. I do not want to leave you frustrated and angry. I do appreciate the help you've given us. The media has been critical to this investigation, getting the word out. Thank you for your patience.
It seemed the public and the press would have to settle for the details mentioned in the Inquirer article that ran with the photos. Sensational, lurid, and incriminating, they put a far more sinister filter on the pictures, and soon Scott found himself besieged by law enforcement, media, and the public. Through it all, he not only maintained contact with Amber, but said he was glad she'd gone to the police. He'd called her twice on the 24th, once while she was in the corridor just before going on camera, and again shortly after she spoke, but she sent him to voicemail each time. Amber tried to call him 3 times between 3 and 4 o'clock the next afternoon, shortly after leaving Sharon Rocha's house on the 25th, but this time it was Scott who didn't answer. He connected with her not long after, but their call was brief. He only had just enough time to tell Amber how brave she was and what amazing character she had for speaking out. Later that evening, they had a longer conversation, during which he told her he'd listened to her statement on the radio while he was driving, and that he'd gotten so upset when he heard her cry, he had to pull over to throw up. Amber reminded him to let her know when he planned to tape his interview with Diane Sawyer on Good Morning America so she could watch it when it aired, before bidding him goodnight. But as Scott began to deal with the pressure from all sides while still working hard to salvage some semblance of a relationship with his mistress, Laci's family grieved. Now convinced the chances of finding her and baby Connor alive were slim to none, they shifted their mindset from a search to a recovery, plunging Sharon's mind into the darkest of places. Since she and Ron met with detectives on the 15th, she was incapable of stopping herself from relentlessly thinking about what Laci's last moments with Scott may have been like, and she was tormented, imagining the pain, fear, and heartbreak she must have felt as she gazed into his eyes while taking her last breath. Did he poison her? Did she suffer or fight? Did she know it was Scott who was killing her? Did she realize why? Unable to temper her grief and terror over the past 2 days and still crying uncontrollably on the 17th, Kim Peterson became concerned and made a call to lead detective Craig Grogan. Grogan came by the house around 9 o'clock that evening in hopes he could offer Sharon some small measure of peace. He told her they had no evidence of a violent struggle, believing Laci had been strangled or smothered while she slept. It didn't help much, but his words did ease her mind a bit. She was at least able to dismiss a few of the more horrific images that had been cycling through her mind. Once she was somewhat settled by that small comfort, Sharon thanked Grogan for his visit and for his help. But before he left her, he delivered her a very special gift. Placing a small box in her hand, he explained that the package came from an anonymous sender. It had been delivered to the police station in the care of Chief Wasden, with instructions to be passed along to Sharon Rocha. Inside the box was a beautiful gold pin, crafted into the shape of a ribbon and adorned with brilliant blue sapphires. Sharon treasured the pin, keeping it close and wearing it often. It served as a symbol of her love and hope for Laci and Connor, and she's always lamented not knowing who to thank for it. But while Laci's mother was hanging on by a thread on the 17th, Scott was on the phone with Amber, worried about how she was coping after the photos came out. It was another long conversation, and Scott must have finalized the details for his trip to the coast beforehand, possibly driving to LA while they spoke. He left town sometime on the 17th, with plans to open another volunteer center in Los Angeles. But by the time Scott got there, the atmosphere had changed from bad to worse, and his affair with Amber not only stole the spotlight, but tainted the entire purpose for his trip to LA. Nothing seemed to have gone as planned. The new volunteer center wound up replacing the old one, rather than becoming a supplement to it. As Terry Western locked the Modesto location on the same day, the space at the Doubletree Hotel became operational. And in contrast to the support and positive press the Red Lion received for generously donating their conference rooms, the staff at the Doubletree in LA were harassed, and the brand amassed some negative press just for working with Scott. The front desk began to receive calls from a hostile public, accusing the staff and management of supporting a murderer. And Scott's bad karma must have rode shotgun on his way back to Modesto, because when he arrived home on the evening of the 19th, he found that an intruder had broken through the French doors and ransacked the house. The details surrounding the break-in and the maladjusted culprit responsible are too wild to skip over or skimp on, but they're also a bit too long to cover here properly without straying too far from the timeline. So be on the lookout for a bonus episode in the near future about this crazy break-in. And you're going to want to subscribe and hit the bell for this one, because it's a doozy. Initially, Scott wondered if Laci's father Dennis or her older brother Brent might have been behind the break-in, and Scott's father Lee theorized that her stepfather Ron Gransky could have been involved as well. But although the guilty party did turn out to be someone Scott knew, both he and his father missed the mark by a long shot with their suspects. Scott's mother Jackie didn't much care who it was that had broken into the house. All she knew was that things weren't going well for Scott in Modesto, and she feared for his safety. She had him call his recently acquainted sister Ann Bird that very day to see if he could stay at her place out near Berkeley until things settled down. On January 20th, the day after the break-in, he arrived at the home Ann shared with her husband Tim and their 2 young boys, Ryan and Tommy, but he was angry when he got there. In early January, detectives began working with the Enterprise location nearest to Scott's house to place GPS monitors on his rental cars, and it seems his rotten luck struck again, not realizing there'd been a tracker under his seat for weeks until the same day he moved to Berkeley, an hour and a half away, and still finding he was unable to remove it. The last time Ann Bird saw Laci was at the end of November. It's not clear if she joined the family for Thanksgiving dinner, but she definitely attended Laci's baby shower and visited Disney during their trip to San Diego. She was also invited to go on the annual Christmas trip to Carmel with Scott, Laci, Jackie, and Lee, and even though Ann couldn't make it, she still had gossip to share about Jackie's behavior during the trip. Laci had actually spent a lot of time alone with Jackie in Carmel over the weekend of the 15th, mainly because Scott spent most of it on the golf course with Lee, and partially because Jackie's lungs took a bad turn before they left San Diego. She wasn't able to do much of the window shopping and scouting for antiques she and Laci enjoyed on previous visits. But in spite of the extra time they'd spent alone, or perhaps because of it, when Ann spoke with Jackie not long after, the matriarch only had nasty things to say about her daughter-in-law, taking aim at Laci's fashion sense, saying how silly she looked wearing white gloves with a white scarf, and laughing as she compared Laci to Minnie Mouse. Ann was relieved to hear she didn't actually say those things to Laci, but after Jackie told her the black gloves and black scarf she wore the next day weren't much of an improvement, Ann figured Laci probably took the hint the day before, tried to switch things up, going out of her way to please her mother-in-law, but obviously falling short. To hear Ann Bird tell it, the trip to Carmel by the sea with Scott and her in-laws was hardly worth leaving Mackenzie outside for. And then there was the business with the thank you notes. Laci'd mailed out the thank you cards from her baby shower not long after she and Scott returned home from what must have been an exhausting trip to San Diego. They'd celebrated Thanksgiving and spent 2 days at Disney before doing her shower, which became a bit more stressful when Ann Bird's 3-year-old son Ryan colored on the walls of the venue. But when Jackie mentioned her thank you card from the shower, she expressed her disappointment with the message Laci wrote inside, calling it, quote, by the book, end quote. Ann told Jackie the card she'd received was lovely and heartfelt, sending her gratitude for Connor's gift and saying she looked forward to their boys playing together someday. But Ann never asked what exactly Laci had written, and Jackie never volunteered it, so we'll never know. However, we can speculate on a possible reason why Jackie was so underwhelmed with Laci's thank you card. She may have been looking for more recognition after purchasing Connor's crib, along with several other items for the nursery. But it seems she should have expected a lukewarm response, regardless of how much money she spent on her grandson. That is, if her nasty treatment of her daughter-in-law was accurate. Scott affirmed that at least some of their discord was valid when he and Ann spoke soon after. Now, of course, Ann didn't want to stir the pot by sharing Jackie's comments with Scott, but she couldn't help but bring it up, simply because it didn't sit well with her. She actually intended to tell a very pregnant Laci about it, but she wasn't home, so she mentioned the drama to Scott instead. His response suggested it wasn't the first time Laci and Jackie had been at odds, saying, yeah, those two. And the exasperated sigh he added right after signaled that he wasn't best pleased to hear about a new piece of drama between them. But whether Laci's thank you note for Jackie was lacking or not, it seems her mother-in-law was unaware that when we buy cribs, toys, and clothes for our grandbabies, most of us aren't in it for the thank you cards or recognition. Now that we're back aboard the gossip train with Ann, let's go over her involvement in the search for Laci, before things went off the rails after Scott moved in with her and her family. We've already discussed the depth of the relationship between Anne, Jackie, Scott, and Laci, concluding that it was rather shallow. This wasn't through the fault of anyone involved, really. It was simply just the way things played out. After only being introduced to the Petersons just a few years before, and not having much private time with any of them since, there wasn't a great opportunity for them to be close. This partially explains why Laci had been missing for 3 days before Anne learned anything was amiss in Modesto. Anne and Tim had taken their boys, Ryan and Tommy, to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, to spend Christmas with Tim's family, but either of them had cell phone numbers for any of the Petersons, and apparently they didn't have Anne or Tim's either. Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and Boxing Day all came and went, with Anne left out of the loop. It wasn't until Tim flew back home to Berkeley, checking the message on the answering machine on the 27th, that he and Anne learned Laci was in danger. Tim called Jackie right away, gathering a few details along with her cell number, before making another call to Anne's adoptive mother, Geraldine Grady. Instead of heading home to Berkeley with Tim, Anne and their boys traveled to the Grady house in Point Loma, just southeast of San Diego, to celebrate a belated Christmas with her adoptive family. Jerry told her to call Tim the moment she arrived, but when he told her Laci'd been abducted, Anne didn't take the news too seriously. She thought it was a joke, saying, "Abducted? Abducted by who? Aliens?" But Tim wasn't laughing, and his tone was somber and firm as he told Anne Laci'd been missing for days, and that she needed to take down Jackie's number and call her as soon as possible. Anne was stunned as Jackie explained Laci's disappearance on Christmas Eve, but she wasn't able to answer many of the questions Anne had about what in the world could have happened to her. Jackie knew about as much as anyone else at the time, aside from detectives, of course, and maybe Scott, so she couldn't fill in any of the blanks for Anne, and she also didn't have much time to talk. But by the time Anne hung up with Jackie, Jerry had found an article about Laci that ran the day before, and Anne said she feared she was going into shock by the time they'd finished reading it. A short while later, Anne thought to call Jackie back to ask if the family needed anything, or if there was anything she could do to help. Jackie said there were already so many people searching in Modesto, her being there wouldn't have made much of an impact. At the time, she and Lee had been booted out of the house, along with Scott and the rest of the family, beginning her lengthy stay at the Red Lion Hotel, as the police conducted search warrants on the house and the warehouse. The warrant had been served and the police were done by the 27th, and Scott went back home on the 28th, but his parents didn't go with him. Apparently Scott wanted his privacy, something that seemed to irk Jackie a bit, but by the 27th, she was also running out of clothes. She and Lee hadn't traveled from home to Modesto, and she'd only packed clothes for a couple of nights' stay with other family over Christmas. So rather than have Anne go to Modesto to help with the search, Jackie sent her up to their beach house to raid the closets so she could replenish her wardrobe. The Grady's house in Point Loma was just 40 minutes south of the Petersons' beach house in Solana Beach, so she and Jerry made the drive north together, where they let themselves in with the key under the mat. While Anne packed practical clothes and sneakers appropriate for Jackie to search outdoors, Jerry tidied up the house a bit. It was strange for Anne to have Jerry there going through Jackie's closet, but the state of the house when they arrived was stranger still. The place was a mess, with clothes thrown everywhere and all of the beds were unmade, and a half-eaten plate of food sat on the table. Awkward or no, it was enough of a wreck for Geraldine to immediately start cleaning, while Anne copied the 18 unplayed messages off of the answering machine to take back to Jackie. But as she watched her mother pick up, Anne suddenly realized they should probably leave things as they were, considering the circumstances with Laci. She told Jerry to stop cleaning and not to disturb anything else before playing the last few messages, locking up, placing the key back under the mat, and heading to FedEx to overnight Jackie's clothes to Modesto. Though there's never been any explanation given for the state of the place, Anne had seen enough episodes of Murder, She Wrote to know better than to disturb potential evidence. In fact, after he moved in with her, she learned Scott was a fan of the show as well, and the two watched several episodes together during the weeks he stayed with her. But that was before she realized the murder mystery was no longer just an entertaining fictional story, safely playing out behind her television screen, but a real live horror show she'd invited to live in her home with her family. When Scott arrived at her house in Berkeley on the 20th of January, she still viewed him as a victim. A man who must have been a distraught mess, not knowing what'd become of his wife and his baby, who she thought he loved so much. But just like with Sharon and Amber, it didn't take much observation for them all to see that that wasn't the case. Anne's husband Tim wasn't thrilled with Scott being in the house to begin with. They barely knew him, to be honest, and he had 2 kids to think about. But he relented because technically Scott was family, and as we all know, you do for family. Anne had been plastered to the news every day since returning home from Point Loma 3 weeks before, and she couldn't have missed his photos with Amber that saturated every station for the better part of a week by then. But Anne implies that she and Tim didn't learn about Amber until the 21st, just one day after Scott got settled in their loft with a view of the bay. She said by the 21st, she and Tim had already begun a 3-day retreat from the stress, taking their boys to a resort in Mexico when they heard the news about Amber Frey. It seems Scott must be a pretty stressful guy to be around, because according to Anne's timeline, the family headed south for the border for their getaway not long after he arrived at their house. But in her book, she makes it seem as though Scott's weird behavior started the moment he arrived. So it's anyone's guess when the wine drinking, rude behavior, and flirting with the babysitter actually went on. But one thing is for certain. The Petersons were told about Scott's affair with Amber the same evening the Rochas were. While Detectives Bueller and Brocchini spoke with Sharon and Ron and Modesto on the 15th, Detective Grogan drove to San Diego to tell Lee about Amber Frey face-to-face. But strangely, one of his first questions was whether or not it was the girl from Sacramento, implying that Lee may have known a bit more about his son's wandering eye than he let on. It seems everyone on both sides of the family knew about Amber Frey by the 16th, 4 days before Scott moved into Anne's house, except for Anne. Although there are reports that Jackie very well may have been sheltered from the news until reading it for herself in the Bee on the 21st. But if true, even Jackie had already seen the photos by then. She'd just been lied to about the context. The claim is that in an attempt to shield his wife from the stress and protect her frail health, Lee explained the photos away by telling Jackie the pictures with Amber were just a misunderstanding, that they'd been taken at a Christmas party Scott and Laci attended together, and that the blonde in the photo was a mutual friend or a work colleague. But when the media got a hold of it, they made up their own narrative to fit their salacious articles. As we know now, the truth would turn out to be a tale stranger than fiction. But if these reports are rooted in truth, we may have a bit of a clue as to how Scott picked up his habit of justifying a lie, by spinning it into a protective and even noble act. While Anne's timeline seems a bit convoluted, Detectives Grogan and Bueller's weren't. They were working hard on the 22nd to sort through the massive details they'd acquired so far. The goal was to sharpen the focus of their investigation, with hopes of shedding some light on physical evidence they needed to solve Laci's case. By this point, the tragic reality for them was that the best prospect they had for that would be to locate Laci and Connor's remains. As the detectives reviewed their notes, they compiled a list of reasons why they were still convinced they would find Laci in the bay. Grogan's list was read for the jury the following year during Scott's trial. But the same evening Grogan and Bueller made the list, Scott was on the phone with his realtor, Brian Argan, to ask him about selling the house. This call has been reconstructed from the transcript and posted in a separate playlist on the channel if you're interested in hearing it. Keep in mind that the majority of Scott's calls to Amber, the Rochas, friends, detectives, and others, such as Brian Argan, have never been heard before, because the audio has never been made available to the public. But with the help of AI, we're working on piecing the transcripts together to create listenable conversations. However, this is an extremely time-consuming process for each call, so please be patient with the work in progress. Because Scott's call with realtor Brian Argan is relatively short, we've uploaded it as a companion video to this episode, but be on the lookout for new conversations as well as they're added to the playlist. Initially, Scott wanted to list the house with the same realtor who sold it to them, Terry Western. Terry was a close friend of Sharon Rocha's and mother of Laci's best friend, Stacy Boyers, but she'd also been selling houses in Modesto for many years. Terry actually had a hand in securing the space for the volunteer center at the Red Lion on the 26th of December, and she was involved with closing it on the 17th of January as well. It was there at the Red Lion about 2 weeks prior to its closing that Scott mentioned selling the house. But Terry told him it was neither the time nor the place to discuss it and suggested they revisit the idea once things with Laci were figured out. But Scott didn't want to wait. He told Brian they couldn't possibly stay there, however things turned out with Laci. And when asked about it later in an interview, he sarcastically asked the reporter who the hell would want to live in a house their wife had been abducted from. On the 23rd, Amber traveled to the police station in Modesto to take a polygraph test and submit hair samples, returning the next day to give her statement to the press. But Sharon and Brent made their own announcement 2 hours before Amber spoke, conveying a drastically different tone about Laci and her husband. They renounced their support for Scott and read emotional messages to Laci, apologizing for not protecting her when she needed them, and expressing their heartbreak after she and little Connor had been ripped out of their lives. They thanked everyone in the community for their support and for helping to run the volunteer center while it was open. But the shift in their mood was palpable, leaving the public with the impression they no longer expected to find Laci and Connor alive. Amber took the podium at the police station not long after, and Sharon struggled to watch. But the next day, as the two women sat together, contrasting the promises he made to Amber with the lies he told Laci before she vanished, Sharon suddenly excused herself to the kitchen, unable to listen to another word. A moment later, she quietly signaled for Renee Tomlinson to get Amber out of her house. Every detail she'd heard broke her down a bit more, and she'd spent the past month so hyper-focused on finding Laci and Connor and thinking about so little else, she'd only recently realized the casserole she made for Christmas Eve was still in her oven, symbolic of her world coming to a complete standstill the instant she received the horrifying call from Scott. She'd lived in hope of finding Laci and Connor alive every minute since, and the open faucet of intense grief, rage, panic, guilt, and confusion had taken its toll over the past month, and after talking with Amber, realizing her daughter was never coming back, hopelessness began to eclipse them all. Sharon would eventually find herself immersed in a pool of despair, but as she tried to function through the pain, anger rose to the surface first. She and Ron were scheduled to tape an interview with John Walsh shortly after Amber left the house, but already in a foul mood after dealing with multiple delays, her patience and energy were spent, and Sharon threatened to back out of the interview. She'd never passed up on a chance to spread the word about her missing daughter, not once since taking over as the spokesperson for the family, and Kim Peterson made a note of the change. Kim asked if she was holding up okay, and Sharon was honest, recognizing that she was far from okay. But she also knew that all the hosts that she may have had to cancel with, John Walsh would understand why more than all the rest. The producer called not long after, but by the time she agreed to attend the taping, Sharon was fully aware her mind was descending down a dark path, but she didn't care. She did the interview at the DoubleTree Hotel at 6 o'clock that evening, letting Ron take the lead and not talking much. But when they made it outside, Sharon sat down on the sidewalk, broken, not wanting to do anything but lie right there and go to sleep. Ron gathered her up and got her home, but she stopped in her tracks coming through the door when she saw Laci sitting on the sofa. Her back was to the door, but it was unmistakably her. She'd finally come home, and there she was, on the sofa, waiting for them. Then she watched as her beautiful daughter turned around to flash her 1,000-watt smile as she said, "Hi, Mom." When Ron bumped into her in the doorway and asked Sharon what was wrong, she said, "Oh my God, Laci's come home." As her name left her lips, Laci repeated her cheerful greeting, "Hi, Mom." But when Sharon blinked, Laci was gone. She made her way to her bed for the first time since Laci disappeared, crying herself to sleep as she wondered if this was the first step along her path to madness, and the next morning she couldn't get up. After a long while laying there awake, totally covered with her blankets, motionless in the fetal position, Ron came in to check on her. She had half of her face buried in the pillow as he asked her, "Aren't you going to get up?" She didn't respond, and she didn't move. That Sunday was Brent's birthday, but Sharon couldn't help herself. She buried herself in the bed and shut down. She'd found a way to block her pain by stopping everything else along with it. But when Ron came back in later to find her in the exact same spot and still unresponsive, he got worried, calling Sharon's close friend, Sandy Pritchard. Sandy had no luck in drawing Sharon up from the depths either, and soon Patty and Lynn were at her bedside as well, trying to comfort her and coax her into engaging with them, but to no avail. Sharon, of course, could hear all of them and felt terrible for making them all worry. But she knew if she came back up and started thinking again, the relentless pain she was so desperate to stop would immediately take over again. So she stayed in that quiet void she'd made for herself a while longer. But as Ron and her friends became increasingly concerned, Sharon's guilt won out, and she took a chance during a moment alone with Sandy to whisper that she was okay, hoping the short, simple interaction would be small enough that she could sink below the depths again, while letting them all know that she was mostly all right. But she was wrong on both fronts. Her quiet whisper instantly dissolved into more uncontrollable tears, and her tiny assertion that she was okay did nothing to convince Ron or anyone else that that was anywhere near true. They'd already called Kim Peterson to the house, who took one look at Sharon and contacted Phil Trumpeter, a psychologist on staff at the Modesto Police Department. By the time Trumpeter arrived at the house, Sharon had improved a bit. Well, she was vocal again, and that was a start. She'd also began to have a worry about what was happening to her, and was especially concerned about her vision of Laci the night before, wondering if she might be experiencing some kind of psychotic break. She'd seen Laci so vividly, and heard her voice so clearly, she asked Trumpeter if the hallucination was a sign she was losing her mind. He told her not to worry, explaining that the brain has peculiar ways of protecting itself, theorizing that she shut the stimuli out for just long enough to insulate herself from becoming overwhelmed by the intense stress and emotion that came along with her horrific situation. And he told Sharon that her mind manifested the vision of Laci simply because she so desperately needed to see her, reassuring her that it was a common thing in cases of extreme mental stress and grief. A few days after Sharon's breakdown, Jackie called Ann with another favor. Modesto PD investigators said they were having trouble verifying Scott's trip to Berkeley. She wanted Ann to ask around at the marina if anyone saw him or his boat that day. Of course, living just 5 minutes from the marina, Ann agreed, and thanks to Don Chapman, she didn't have to go alone. Jackie's other adopted child, Don, flew from the East Coast to California on the 27th, shortly after getting the news about Laci. In fact, he'd actually beaten Ann home from her parents' place in Point Loma, 8 hours south of Berkeley. And so, on the 28th of December, Ann and Don headed to the boat launch to look for witnesses to help their new little brother, just after Trimble, the trailing dog, signaled the end of the trail for Laci on the dock where Scott launched his boat on Christmas Eve. She and Don collected 4 statements that day. The first was from a man named David. The statement reads as follows. David lives on a boat that you pass on your right when you launch from the marina. He remembers seeing your truck parked with the trailer and particularly remembers the toolbox in the truck. David seems to know everybody at the marina and is kind of conducting his own mini investigation. David has spoken to many of his co-boat owners about the incident and has much information. David has talked to investigators. The second man is named Mike. Anne's notes about Mike read as follows. Mike is a groundskeeper who works at the marina. He told us that he specifically remembers you launching the boat in great detail. He stated he remembers you having to back around a white Astro van and hitting the dock and thinking that you probably couldn't see the trailer because the trailer seemed too small for the truck. Mike has also spoken to detectives. The next statement was from a man named Nick. We did not speak to Nick directly. Nick apparently lives in the area, frequently visits the boat very close to David's. He also rides his bike through the marina area daily. Both Mike and David know Nick. Mike believes that Nick did see you launch the boat that day in question. Anne was told by Mike or David, not sure which, that Nick had spoken to detectives via telephone. The last man mentioned in Anne's notes is Cliff. Cliff is the City of Berkeley supervisor over the groundskeepers and maintenance workers. We did not speak to him directly. Mike gave us his name and number. We obtained a boat launch receipt to check the accuracy of the times. I faxed the receipt to the Red Lion Hotel tonight. I noticed that all the receipts show 11:59 p.m. in large lettering because that is the time all receipts expire on the day they were purchased. The actual purchase time is shown in smaller letters further up on the receipt. Anne emailed her notes to Scott at the Red Lion Hotel not long after. But not much more seems to have come of it. Anne and Tim didn't attend Laci's vigil a few days later on New Year's Eve, watching it on TV instead. And aside from mailing Jackie's clothes to her and searching for witnesses at the marina for Scott, she wasn't much involved in Laci's case until Scott moved into her house on the 20th of January. After he arrived there, her time was split between pacifying Jackie as she became more irate over the press and the police, and drinking lots of wine with Tim and Scott while she tried to keep the peace between them. By late January, Jackie was well past her limit with reporters and investigators. Calling Anne frequently to vent, she would call the reporters stupid and ask how such idiots ever got to wear the badge at the police department. All Anne could really do was tell Jackie they were trying their best. But she had to be careful about what she said, knowing Jackie was already beginning to lash out at people who began to have doubts about Scott. But her husband Tim was far more difficult to placate, and he picked up on all the red flags that came from Scott from day one, beginning with his inappropriate laid-back attitude during their first dinner together. The three of them finished a couple of bottles of wine with their dinner, but Scott acted like he didn't have a care in the world, and it freaked him out immediately. That night, as Anne got her little brother settled in their loft, pointing out that she'd put Ralph Lauren sheets on the bed, Scott ventured to the window, gazing out at the lights of the Bay Bridge in the distance. She'd find him gazing out that window more than a few times while he stayed with them, but it took a while for her to attach any meaning to it. In the meantime, she bid Scott good night and went to find Tim in their bed. He was lying down, but far from asleep, looking at her wide-eyed when she came in. "What?" she said. "Are you at all bothered by this?" he asked. "By what?" "By him. By having him here." "No," she said. "I'm not going to be like everyone else. This whole world assumes he's guilty." "That should tell you something," he said. "It doesn't tell me anything," said Anne. "The whole world doesn't know him like I know him." "What was it your brother Don said?" Tim asked. "How well do you know Scott? Isn't that what Don said?" "You know something, Tim," said Anne. "I'm not going to argue with you. In this country, people are innocent until proven guilty. I know Scott pretty well. I know he's not capable of doing something so horrible, and I'm not even going to go there." "I don't know," said Tim. "I sort of expected him to be more screwed up over this. He seemed fine at dinner. He seemed like a guy who didn't have a care in the world." "He was making an effort to be sociable," Anne said. "It didn't seem like it took much effort," Tim retorted. "It was the wine, then," snapped Anne. A few days later, after another night of washing down their dinner with multiple bottles of wine, the three of them turned on the nightly news, not surprised to see the program was about Laci. But when Anne noticed Scott wasn't even looking at the TV, she got a bit irritated, frustrated that he didn't want to learn every update in detail like she did. Anne pulled out a large map and spread it across her dining room table, and when Scott asked what she was doing, she told him to have a look at it with her, just to see if any of the places sparked a memory or a connection to Laci he may have forgotten, if there was anywhere special to her or more likely for her to go than any other. But this instantly annoyed him, and after Anne asked a few more questions, he got nasty and sarcastic. He waved his fingers in the air in a dramatic flourish, not even looking at the map before he brought it down on a place called Mapes Ranch, saying, "Here, I think they maybe haven't looked for her here." Anne didn't totally take his meaning and didn't pick up on his attitude right away, asking if Laci knew Mapes Ranch and if it was special to her, not realizing he was being a jerk until he dismissively said, "We've been past it," before walking away. But Tim took his meaning well enough while he was still waving his finger around, patronizing his wife, and when he caught Anne's eyes as he made a beeline for their bedroom, she could tell Tim was now officially pissed at Scott. Just a few days after that, Tim found out Anne gave him a key to their house, and she could tell he was very upset just by the look on his face. "What do you want me to do?" she said. "He's my brother." Tim snapped back. "I know he's your brother. You keep reminding me of that." The two of them tried to prevent the situation from driving them apart, but she worried that Tim was about at his limit, and all they seemed to be doing about it was drinking more wine. Tim's animosity continued to grow towards Scott, and Anne wasn't quite ready to consider his guilt, but she was becoming aggravated, feeling like Scott was treating their home like a motel, and she was stressed out, being caught in the middle between Tim and Scott, constantly fighting herself, apologizing, making excuses, and defending her brother. But things between Anne and Tim would only go from bad to worse after watching Amber Frey give her press conference on the 24th. They'd watched Amber's statement together, and the moment she'd stopped speaking, she could feel Tim's eyes on her, knowing full well what was coming. "What do you think now?" he asked. "I don't know. He was having an affair. It doesn't mean he hurt Laci." "Are you kidding me?" he said. He was furious. "Are you honestly going to tell me you believe he's innocent?" "Tim," she said, "I don't know what to believe anymore." "Well, that Amber girl isn't lying," he shot back. "Why would she lie? You don't go to the police and make up a story about having an affair with some guy who forgot to tell you he was married, and you especially don't go to them if the guy's wife is missing." "What are you saying?" she said. "I'm saying you better start doing some serious thinking about your little brother." "What do you want me to do, Tim?" "I don't want him in our house," he said. "That's not fair," said Anne. "He has nowhere to go." "You're not his only family, okay? He's got other family. You wouldn't even know about him if that Don guy hadn't shown up with this great news about your birth mother," said Tim. She was in tears now. "After this, everyone's going to turn on him. He needs us," she said. "I don't want him in my house. I don't want him around my kids," said Tim. "Why don't we give him the chance to explain? He's a pathological liar, maybe worse. What's he going to tell you? 'Hey sis, I didn't do it.' So you're just going to assume he's guilty?" "I don't think it was the guy with the Confederate flags, okay? Or the burglars across the street either," said Tim. "Do you think Laci's dead?" said Anne. "Of course I think Laci's dead. Everyone thinks Laci's dead. Everyone but you," he said. "Don't you want to hear it from him?" said Anne. "No, I told you. I don't want him in our house. I'm not putting him out on the street, Tim. I can't do that. Sometimes men just stray." "You know what? They do stray," said Tim. "But I don't think very much of a man like that." "Okay," said Anne. "He cheated on her, and it's wrong. But like Lee said, it doesn't mean he hurt Laci." "He's a coward," said Tim. "He's a coward and a cheat. And brother or no brother, I think he's much worse." "I just can't believe that about Scott," said Anne. "Why?" he said. "Because I can't. He cheated on Laci," said Tim. "He lied to all of us. Then he comes to our house and whines about the way he's being treated by the press and by the police and by the people on the streets. But when do you ever hear him talking about Laci? When has he ever said he misses her? When have you ever seen him break down? Anne couldn't much argue with that, but she still tried, and now she had no choice but to confront Scott about his affair. His relationship with Amber was an uncomfortable topic for Anne to broach with Scott, but she was at a turning point with him. Like Sharon, she did all she could to convince herself he hadn't done this monstrous thing, but after she and Tim had it out, she decided she needed to get Scott's side of the story, but she didn't feel much better after getting it. "I want to know about Amber," she said. "She's nothing," said Scott. "It was just a fling, down and dirty. It meant nothing." "I don't understand," Anne said. "It happens, okay," said Scott, cutting her off. "People cheat. Don't act like people never cheat. I mean, I remember one time on this long flight, I took turns with 2 women in 2 separate bathrooms. And another time, there was this girl in San Luis Obispo. It was just sex, nothing else." "Did Laci know?" Anne ventured to ask. "Yes," he said dismissively, turning away to avoid her eyes. "And she was extremely pissed off, okay? She'll get through it," he added. "She's been through it before. It was no big deal." At this point, Anne knew he was lying and didn't pursue it. "What are you going to do?" she asked him. "Nothing," he said. "It's just as well people know. Now we can concentrate on what really matters." He'd shocked Anne with his description of his infidelity over the years, but some of the most twisted details about his relationship with Amber didn't come out until after the trial, details that would have given her serious pause about moving him into their home. Of course, Anne knew Scott attended her son's baptism on the 12th of January, but she had no idea he'd headed home to add dirty movies to his cable package that night. Either before or after, he did a little Bible study with Amber over the phone. They talked about the parable of the seed and the sower from the book of Luke, and Scott told Amber he needed to find some good soil for the 2 of them. But even more twisted was his attorney's claim that watching smut was a form of therapy for Scott, helping him work through his grief over Laci and Connor. Later, his defense pointed out that anyone with Scott's phone number could have added those channels to his cable bill. But Anne concluded this wasn't very likely after discovering some other evidence Scott left at her house. Anne confronted Scott at the end of January, not long after Amber's press conference and Sharon's breakdown. But it was clear Sharon wasn't alone in her grief over the implications of Scott's affair. The rest of her family and friends felt the anguish after learning about his deception as well, seeing it as the last nail in the coffin for Laci and Connor. And it seems Amber didn't give them much opportunity to avoid thinking about it. Over the next several weeks, she'd made contact with Laci's friends and family members over 53 times, spending over 6.5 hours on the phone with them collectively through the middle of March. She called Brent 9 times, talked to Amy twice, and had 4 calls with Sharon. But more than half of those 6.5 hours were spent talking to Lori Ellsworth, who Amber must have grown particularly close with by the 28th of January when Scott's Diane Sawyer interview aired. Amber asked Scott to let her know when it would be on so she could watch it, but he had no idea she and Lori would be watching it simultaneously while they chatted on the phone. Their call was over 90 minutes long, likely meaning they'd discussed it for a good long while after it was over as well. We couldn't find the full interview, but after watching the clip we do have, you'll wonder how Amber and Lori were ever able to keep their conversation so short.
Everybody sitting at home wants the answer to the same question. Did you murder your wife?
No, I did not. And I had absolutely nothing to do with her disappearance. And use the word murder, and yeah, I mean, that is a possibility. It's not one we're ready to accept, and it creeps in my mind late at night and early in the morning. And during the day, all we can think about is the right resolution is to find her well.
But as you know, increasingly, in the public, suspicion has turned on you.
Yes, definitely.
Did you ever hit her? Did you ever injure her?
No. My God, no. Violence towards women is unapproachable. It is the most disgusting act to me. And I know that suspicion has turned to me. And it's turned to me, one, because I'm her husband, and that's a natural thing. And I've heard all the statistics on all the news shows about that being, you know, someone that a husband, ex-husband, a boyfriend, that is statistically one who would be responsible for her disappearance. And I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
Did you ever hit her? Did you ever injure her?
No, never. I was answered your question because of the suspicion that it's been turned to me. And it turned to me because of the inappropriate romantic that I had with Amber Frey.
Amber Frey went public about the romance after seeing all the stories about Laci Peterson's disappearance.
I met Scott Peterson November 20th, 2002. I was introduced to him. I was told he was unmarried.
Amber Frey came forward.
I'm glad she did.
You are?
Definitely.
Why?
It's the appropriate thing to do. And it really shows what a person of character she is. And it allows us to get back looking for Laci.
Did you tell her that you were not married?
I did. I did. And then when Laci disappeared, I called her, and admittedly it wasn't immediately. It was a couple days after Laci's disappearance that I telephoned her and told her the truth.
The truth?
That I was married, that Laci disappeared. She didn't know about it at that point. And then she contacted the police.
But Frey says she first found out about Laci from the news, not from Scott.
Were you in love with her?
No.
Was this the first time? Are there others out there?
No.
There's no one else who can come forward?
No. I owe a tremendous apology to everyone.
Had you told anyone? Did you tell police?
Told the police immediately.
When?
That was the first night we were together. The police, I spent with the police.
You told them about her?
Yeah, from December 24th on.
That wasn't true, and Scott Peterson called us after the interview to set the record straight. He said he never told the police about his affair with Amber Frey, but claims he did tell his wife.
Did your wife find out about it?
I told my wife.
When?
In early December.
Did it cause a rupture in the marriage?
It was not a positive, obviously. It's inappropriate. But it was not something that we weren't dealing with.
A lot of arguing?
No. I can't say that even, she was okay with the idea. But it wasn't anything that would break us apart.
There wasn't a lot of anger?
No.
Do you really expect people to believe that an 8.5-month pregnant woman learns her husband has had an affair and is saintly and casual about it? Accommodating? Makes a peace with it?
Well, you don't know. No one knows our relationship but us. And that's at peace with it, not happy about it.
Why did you tell her?
It was the right thing.
Because again, you know that people sitting at home have imagined that either you were in love with someone else, therefore you decided to get rid of this entanglement, namely your wife and your child, or there was just an angry confrontation.
Neither of those was the case. It's that simple.
He insisted all was well between him and Laci.
Tell me about the state of your marriage. What kind of marriage was it?
God, I mean, the first word that comes to mind is, glorious. I mean, we took care of each other very well. She was amazing. He is amazing.
When Scott Peterson's parents and other family members joined the interview, they said their faith in his innocence never wavered, even though they were surprised about the affair.
Susan, what was your reaction when you heard?
I was very shocked, to be quite honest. It's not in Scott's character.
And when you hear people now out in the country say, did he do it? What do you want to say to them?
He couldn't have if
possible.
It's impossible. If you knew Scott, he's the gentlest soul I think I've ever known.
The police interviewed Scott Peterson 3 times, but after he got a lawyer, he did not talk to them again. His house was searched twice, and more questions about his behavior began to surface.
A neighbor says that the first thing that Laci did every morning was pull open the curtains. But this morning, they were never pulled open.
Yeah, they were down when I returned. It's very common in the summer that she opens up the curtains. But again, we're talking about a day that, I don't know what it was, probably 40 degrees that day or something. And during the winter, we don't open the curtains to keep the house warm.
Nothing to that, nothing suspicious.
No, I mean, certainly I wish if something had happened to her in the house, I wish they'd been open so someone may have been able to stop it. But in the winter, who opens their curtains for the draft?
Another story that is out there is that the kitchen was spotless. And in fact, there was still a wet mop around, which indicated somebody had cleaned something very recently.
Laci was mopping the floors when I left that morning. Yes, the house is spotless. She had a cleaning lady on Monday, the 23rd.
So if the cleaning lady had been there, why have to clean again?
Dog, 2 cats, muddy backyard. She mopped those floors every day. And I emptied the bucket when I returned that afternoon.
There was one report that a neighbor had seen you loading something into a vehicle?
I haven't seen that report.
Did you load anything into a vehicle, anything large?
Some umbrellas, some market umbrellas. Those are those, the umbrellas on the stands that are 8 feet in diameter or something like that.
When did you do that?
That morning.
If all these actions seem suspicious, they're still circumstantial.
I want to go back to a couple of other questions people have. I've heard so many people say, Christmas Eve, you have a very pregnant wife, and you decide to go fishing? What did that say about the two of you?
Well, we had plans that evening with Mom, Laci's mom, over at her house. Frankly, Christmas preparations were done.
What did you get her for Christmas?
Oh, a Louis Vuitton wallet. But preparations were made. Her plan for the day was to prepare gingerbread cookies. My day was open to either play golf or go fishing. I chose fishing that day, which is, a choice I made, and I obviously regret now. If I could just decide to stay home, this would not have happened.
I noticed during the interview he had not yet talked about something.
You haven't mentioned your son.
It's so hard.
Their baby boy was due on February 16th.
Tell me about the nursery.
Can't go in there. The door is closed until there's someone to put in there. but it's ready.
Throughout the interview, he insisted he was innocent.
Are you afraid police will arrest you?
No. I know there's no basis. I mean, I had nothing to do with her disappearance. So there's no possible evidence or anything like that.
Have they given you reason to think that you're their prime suspect?
Yeah, I mean, with with the search warrants for the cars and things like that, certainly. With the a search warrant for the home, when it gets specific to a car, obviously they're looking at me.
Nearly all of the interviews and interactions Scott had with the press were disastrous, but this one was the most widely viewed and the most catastrophic by far. He'd actually invited the Rochas to do the interview with him and his family, but of course they declined. Ann Bird watched every awkward minute of that interview from Berkeley as well, and by the time it was over, she wondered if her husband might be right about getting Scott out of their house. Anne tried nearly as hard as Sharon to believe in Scott's innocence, seeing him as incapable of harming anyone, especially Laci. But Anne saw a different side of Scott, full of sarcasm and selfishness, and she knew parts of the interview she'd just watched were outright lies. Immediately after it aired, she called her mother Jerry to ask for permission to send Scott to their isolated cabin on Lake Arrowhead, 12 hours away. The next day was the 29th, and Scott traded Laci's Land Rover in for a truck he could use for work, causing major backlash for the dealership who bought it. In fact, the locals were so outraged, the car lot sold the Land Rover back to Laci's family for just $1, just to make the transaction legal. Around the same time the Rochas discovered he'd sold her car, they learned he was back to trying to sell the house again as well. And not long after that, they were irritated to learn about a second tip line the Petersons established and began promoting in the media. They also began to see the February 16th due date for Connor popping up in the press. For clarification from our last episode, the due date was not officially changed from the 10th to the 16th, as previously stated, but the 16th was noted in Laci's chart after her second ultrasound in September. But because the 6-day difference was still within the 10-day window surrounding the date established by the first ultrasound in mid-July, no official change was made. It was clarified during the trial that the first ultrasound is more accurate for determining the due date. Around this time, Brent already had plans to gather the press to announce a fresh round of large organized civilian searches, as they'd all but stopped after Amber and the close of the volunteer center. But after hearing what was coming out of the Peterson camp recently, they decided to set the record straight when they went in front of the cameras on the 5th of February.
Well, it's a beautiful day out here today. This is the park Laci used to always come to, and nothing I'd love better than to see her back here. First of all, about the car. People are probably going to wonder how we found out about the car. We've driven by his house and we've seen a new truck there. And Laci's car's not there. So that's how we first found out about the car. And then, we thought until we found out differently that we'd go ahead and purchase the car. And the car was in Scott's name, but thanks to Mr. Roberts, it's in the family's hands now. And we're going to keep it until Laci comes home. About the house. The house is in both names, Laci and Scott's. I find it hard to believe that he thought he could sell it without Laci's signature. Of course, I found it hard to understand a lot of things Scott has done, so why should this be any different? He said since the first night he wanted the focus to be on finding Laci, not on him. Well, with things he's been doing and saying, the focus is all on him. You want to change the focus, Scott? Talk to the Modesto police. End this circus.
Also, we've heard there's another tip line for information about Laci. The only tip line that we support and encourage the public to use is the Modesto Police number, which is 209-342-6166, and the Laci Peterson website at www.lacipeterson.com. On the 10th of February, which is this coming Monday, we've confirmed that date. It's not the 16th. I know people have been putting it in the paper and the news that it's the 16th. The date has been confirmed, the 10th. Thanks for your support. Without you folks, who knows where we'd be. But please understand that this is not the easiest times for us. And especially with the baby coming close, it's not that easy right now. So
Laci's family and friends will be conducting searches during the remaining Saturdays in the month of February. The first search will be held this Saturday, February 8th at 9 a.m. and will include a search of the Delta-Mendota Canal. Volunteers, friends, and family will meet at the Orchard Restaurant parking lot in Beratlis, which is near I-5 and Highway 132. Other tentative locations on the following Saturdays may include Lake Don Pedro on the 15th and Lake Pardee on the 22nd. Additional information will be available on the LaciPeterson.com website. We would like to encourage volunteers to join in the search for Laci. Where appropriate, we encourage searches by boat, horseback, quads, bikes, etc. If you are unable to join us in one of these searches, we still ask that ranchers, farmers, property owners with acreage to search their land and any bodies of water and any areas surrounding their properties. Thank you.
Scott was in Guadalajara, Mexico at a trade show when the Rochas did the press conference, but Anne kept up on the coverage from Berkeley. She stayed updated on Brent's Saturday searches that started on the 8th, and she learned about the ramped-up efforts and the ongoing search around Brooks Island. But when she mentioned the search of the bay to Scott, he got upset. "Why are they wasting their time?" he said. "They're such idiots. They're looking in the wrong place." And when Anne asked where they should be looking, Scott turned to her and sharply asked, "How's my buddy Tim?" Things were even more tense with Tim since Amber's press conference aired 2 weeks before, which was part of the reason why she'd sent Scott to live in her parents' remote cabin 12 hours away. Their conversation about Scott's move was a bit awkward, with Anne presenting the idea as a help to Scott, a way to keep prying eyes away. But Anne was fully aware Scott knew she wanted him out of the house, and that he'd long since worn out his welcome with Tim. Anne's hand shook as she wrote out the directions to the cabin. Once he was gone and her nerves calmed a bit, she took an armful of spent wine bottles to the recycle bin to find it was already spilling over with bottles from the week before. "There's too much wine flowing through this house," she thought, as she came back inside. But as the door closed behind her, Tim asked her a provocative question. "You still think he's innocent?" he asked. "I'm not sure anymore," said Anne. "Well, thank God," he said sarcastically. "At least we're making progress." "That was unnecessary," she said. "What more do you need, Anne? He sits here, watching himself on TV, and he shows no feeling whatsoever. You can't read the guy. Doesn't that spook you?" "Maybe he's traumatized or in shock or something," she said. "Jesus," said Tim. "When are you going to stop making excuses for him?" That evening, with Scott gone, she decided to do some snooping on the computer. She knew his Hotmail password was Biscuit Love, a pet name he had for Laci, but she couldn't figure out how to access his email account with it, although she did know how to check the browser history on her computer. And after seeing that Scott had been looking at filthy videos, she became upset and quit her investigation. It seems that wouldn't be enough to stop digging for clues that might help to find Laci or to learn something relevant to the investigation, but apparently for Anne it was. Scott continued to make regular visits to the house, often last minute or unannounced. He'd pop in to watch the news with Anne or to have BLTs while they watched Murder, She Wrote, sometimes sleeping over in the loft so he could look out over the bay. One evening as they watched the news together, Scott suddenly started laughing. "What?" she said. He grinned and said, "This is ridiculous. Every night it's the same thing. Scott Peterson, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, Scott Peterson, the most two hated men in the world." Jackie was calling Anne nonstop by then, angrier than ever about the fallout from Amber. She would tell Anne that the Rochas were awful people, and that Sharon in particular was evil. Scott slept with a bimbo, so what, she said. Men just stray sometimes. During one call, she said the police were only searching the bay because Scott went fishing there, which was basically 1,000% true. But it seems Jackie saw the search of the bay as some sort of elaborate publicity stunt, intended to make Scott look guilty, rather than an honest effort to bring Laci home, sarcastically asking Anne what they really expected to find there. Jackie never doubted Scott's innocence for a second, consistently saying things like, "My son's done nothing wrong. Where's the justice?" And she was especially fond of saying, "Scott isn't evil," repeating the phrase often during several of her calls with Anne. Anne agreed with Jackie, at least about the affair, and she still wasn't ready to call her brother evil. She didn't think that cheating alone meant Scott killed Laci and Connor, but it should be noted that Sharon Rocha never thought that either. She loved and trusted Scott, but watched him transform into a stranger after Laci vanished. Instances of his odd behavior were so frequent, they populated lists for her to contemplate long before Amber Frey ever entered the equation. Sharon's always made it clear she's never hung Scott's guilt solely on the affair. By this point, Anne wasn't convinced he was guilty at all, and during our next episode, we'll travel along with her as she introduces Scott to her parents and does a little bit of partying with him with her friends. We'll also talk about how Scott and his mother completely freaked out Anne's 21-year-old babysitter, and we'll discuss the birthday message Scott delivered to her 3-year-old son that left Anne absolutely terrified. But as she sat on her couch with Scott on the 8th of February, and he snapped at her about the searches again and sharply asked about his buddy Tim, Anne may have leveled some of the blame for his nasty attitude on stress, knowing Connor's due date was just around the corner. She was well aware Laci was anxiously expecting to meet their baby boy on the 10th. But what she didn't know was that the 10th was also Amber Frey's birthday. Scott's communication with Amber hadn't slowed a bit since he moved in with the birds, and it turns out his stress on the 8th might have had more to do with picking out the perfect gift for his girlfriend than fretting over when and where his missing wife might go into labor with their son. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the episode, give it a thumbs up before you go. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.